Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. For those of you who didn't attend this morning's session with myself, my name is Ben Clymer. I'm the founder and CEO of Seddiqi. Again, I'll begin by saying just a very quick thank you to the organizers of Dubui Watch Week and the Seddiqi family. This is really a world-class event. It's really been an honor to be here and to experience, to see a totally different perspective on the watch world, and also see many friends that I know from Switzerland, from New York, from all over. So it's really been a wonderful experience. Today, hey guys. Today we are talking about icons and classics, and we have some extremely, they're a little late, I know, but we're talking about icons and classics, and I think what's interesting about this topic is who we have on the panel. So maybe Pascal, could you introduce yourself and a little bit of your history?
Yeah, I'm working for the Fondation Horlogerie FHH, who is partnering with this great event. I'm in charge of the international development, and I'm also a watch collector, or should I say a watch addict, for 20 years. So I don't know if it qualifies, but I think I know a few things about watches. I'm happy to be here to discuss about the icons.
Sure. And Marco, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I'm Marco Borraccino. I'm the founder and co-founder and managing director of Singer Reimagine. It's a new brand that we launched a few months ago in Switzerland. I'm definitely a watch collector, and I actually collect a lot of stuff, not only watches. So the collection and iconic pieces are something that really talks to me.
I would guess that we're all a little guilty of collecting many things on this stage. And Mohammed, if you don't mind.
Yes, good evening. My name is Mohammed Seddiqi. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer of Ahmed Seddiqi and Sons, or Seddiqi Holding. And as the gentleman said, I think we were brought up with watches, so it's in our bloods. We don't love them.
Hello, my name is John Reardon. I'm the head of watches at Christie's, and like the gentleman on the stage, I share a passion for watches. I'm a very, very humble collector, and it's such a pleasure to be here tonight to talk about a fascinating topic, icons.
Yeah. So as we mentioned, the theme for tonight is icons and classics. So an obvious but important first question is, we'll start with John. What do you deem to be the most iconic wristwatch of the 20th century?
Right off the bat.
Well, why wait?
I knew you were going to ask that. So, at my first, I wanted to say the Nautilus. And as you know, I'm a Patek Philippe guy.
Sure.
But my answer is going to be the Patek Philippe perpetual chronograph, the 1518 from 1942. And this piece really redefined the mid-20th century in terms of design. It was the only perpetual chrono on the market for decades. And it is literally the watch that informed the development of chronographs and perpetual chronographs in particular for Patek Philippe for decades to come. And today, many laurels rest on that piece and that idea from the Basel show, 1941.
Sure. And Mohammed, the same question.
I would agree with John regarding the 1518 and how it moved down the years, but also the day date. I would consider it as another iconic 20th century watch, and it has a history behind it, a story behind it, and it's been as it is since the 50s, and it's still called the day date or the president, and people are still wearing it and liking it, even though the size have changed slightly more, but it is an iconic piece in my opinion.
Sure. And Marco?
I would rather approach the question on a style and design point of view, and I think an iconic piece is something that goes through time without aging, and probably the Royal Oak is, in terms of design-wise, is one of the most iconic pieces.
And finally, Pascal.
I was about to say the same. For me, it's, just to add, I think for me it's the first lifestyle watch, mechanical watch, and it was produced in the middle of the quartz crisis, and it just redefined the whole mechanical watch again. But then I have to choose mine. For other reasons, I'll choose the Speedmaster, because there was the first on the moon and probably the only one ever. And there has been before and there is an after because of the Speedmaster, and it hasn't changed for dozens of years and still around, is still very popular, and still pretty much encompasses the sports watches as we like it.
So I think if you think about all of your responses, and these were not kind of premeditated, we have John with an almost very technical, horologically focused answer. The 1518 was, as he said, the first serially produced perpetual calendar chronograph by Patek. Then Mohammed's answer, the date, technically innovative, sure, but certainly not in the same category as the 1518. But it says something very important about its owner. And the date has taken on a meaning far beyond what a 1518 could mean to people in mass, I would say. The Royal Oak may be somewhere in between, technically innovative movement, although available in other watches as well, great case, things like that, and obviously the idea of a luxury steel watch. And then yourself with the Speedmaster. The Speedmaster, obviously great watch, movement available in other watches. So what do you think makes the Speedmaster iconic, and would the Speedmaster be iconic had it not been chosen by NASA to go to the moon?
Well, probably less. It's still a very great design, very distinctive, but I think this particular event made the watch great in a moment. It was very popular before, but it was completely a different story afterwards. So I think design-wise it was not a breakthrough, movement-wise it wasn't either, but basically the sequence of events made it great and even greater today, as there's no more flights to the moon, obviously. Yeah, definitely.
And would you say that Omega's choice to develop so many iterations of the Speedmaster has helped or hurt its iconic status?
Well, I think it was a great marketing around it. It helped sell other watches. I don't think it really had an influence on the original moon watch. It still is today probably the cash cow of Omega, and probably will remain so for a while. And
so even though the Speedmaster has become almost ubiquitous, I mean, we see them everywhere, you still would say it holds a special place in your heart. And is it something that you own? Is it something that you would like to own?
Yeah, I have both. Modern one is a Tintin, as it's called. This has never been endorsed by Tintin, as we know, but I quite like it. It's very distinctive. And I have a 105012 66, which is basically the first reference landing on the moon, which has a really special place in my collection.
Sure. And Marco, you come from this angle, or I'm sorry, you come from this topic from a slightly different angle. You're producing your own watches that I would imagine you hope will become iconic someday. How do you look at that?
Let's say that an iconic watch, to me, is something that breaks some rules, as the Royal Oak did, sure, eventually. It's something that is recognizable, and something that can last and eventually inspire others. This would be my definition of an iconic watch. Saying that, I hope what we did, what we are doing will have the chance to become iconic, because I think we distill some of these tiny ingredients in the design and the development of the watch. Of course, nobody can say I want to design an icon, because who knows? But I think when you make a groundbreaking work in terms of movement, in terms of displaying time, in terms of approaching the watch architecture, you have a chance to achieve this result.
Sure.
I touch wood there, but let's say the spirit of what we have done, it's pretty pure in the sense we really made good watchmaking for the pleasure of good watchmaking. That I think is the first good step to build a brand and a good product.
Sure. And Mohammed, as the person on stage who probably sees the most new watches out of anybody here, are there any new brands or new models that you think have come out in the past 5 years that you think could be a date or could be a Royal Oak? Anything that will be really meaningful in 20, 30, 40 years?
Well, looking at the industry today and the watchmakers that we have with the new technology that is available and design aspect, we see that a lot of people are going back to more and more vintage style in watches. I do believe having geniuses like FP Journe and a few others in the industry today, that they will be icons in the next 20, 30 years for sure. The way they are adding technology to traditional watchmaking will make them iconic in the future. It is a challenging market. There are so many brands in the market today. Will we know today what will be an iconic piece would be difficult to answer. But I believe that there will be many in the next 20 or 30 years from our time, and we would say, yes, we worked with them, we know them, they were our friends, we sat with them, we had panels with them. So I believe, yes, we will have a lot of icons from our time in the next in the near future.
Sure. And then, John, in your role at Christie's, you see the ups and downs of secondary watch values every day. You know, you see that a watch sells for X when new and Y in the secondary market. Do you think this impacts the likelihood of collectible statuses in the future? If a watch such as, let's take, for example, an FP Journe or a datograph from Long & Stone, you know, two amazing products, I don't think anybody would argue, you know, they don't perform necessarily as well in the secondary market. Do you think that decreases the likelihood of them becoming icons in the future?
I think the comparables define the day at auction. And with modern watches, there's more commodity pricing because people are comparing. They're looking online and seeing what pieces are going for. Where vintage watches, the pricing is more unpredictable. It's more factored into condition, supply and demand, and other variables. But I think the future of collecting won't be as much based on the pricing that we see at auction. It's going to be more immediately really derived from the demand. And we're not like a public trading company, a public trading floor. People do look at comps, but we see trends over season after season change so quickly. So FP Journe right now is extremely hot at auction, and we're seeing prices even over the last 2 weeks go up. If it was a stock, it would be the stock you'd want to invest in. And this is very exciting to see how changes are so quick, and it has a lot to do with social media. Hodinkee, people really sharing messages out there of what's happening in the world, and it's immediate, and they put dollars behind it, and they react very quickly.
And so if you had, say, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 of your own money to invest into a modern watch that you think will become an icon, what would you invest in?
Wow, if I could buy a Patek Philippe Nautilus at retail, I would. But that's not going to happen for any of us around the world. What watch would I buy? You know, in under 10,000, I've become quite enamored by Tudor. Yeah. I think that would be the piece I would buy. I think they're gorgeous watches, very wearable. So that would be my choice.
Sure. And Pascal, how about yourself?
Wow. It's not very original, but I was about to say Nautilus. But
Nautilus?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if I go mainstream, yeah. Then in terms of independence, which I think are, banking on some originality that we lack to see over the last few years in a major brands, I would say probably Renaissance, FP Journe, and MB&F as very distinctive designs that can hold their value. Yeah, I think it could be that.
And Marco, the same question.
You don't have to ask me this question. No, let's say that I really like works that are pretty edgy and recognizable. Therefore, watches made by Max Husser or by Felix are very much, in my opinion, pieces that will become very iconic. So I would invest. Sure. A little bit more than 30,000, 40,000, but
yeah. And Mohammed, again, you have kind of an inside look at the demand for some of these watches.
I would look at watches ranging between $20,000 to $30,000. FP Journe with the chronometer blue,
yeah,
which is becoming an icon, but because it's never available,
Sure.
with the special dial that they make with the mirror effect, the case being in tantalum, the movement being in rose gold, I see a future over there. Other than that, I see Moser is a brand that has a big future as well, because they're manufacturing their own movements, and in my opinion, I think they're still cheap for what they're providing to the end consumers. That's at that price range. And then obviously the Rolex is a Rolex, and it will always stay an iconic piece, a design. It's a very basic design. It's available in quantities, but historically, looking at auctions, looking at what some retailers around the world, especially in the region, they have done in the 70s with some logos and making them iconic pieces. We are seeing that this is coming back, and again, we will see more coming in the future in auctions.
Sure. And as somebody who, again, gets to see how the inner workings of Patek Philippe and the retail network work, what is it about the Nautilus that makes it in such demand right now?
It's a difficult question to answer. It's a nice piece. It's an iconic piece. It's been designed by one of the greatest designers of the watch industry, Mr. Gerard Genta. Apart from that, with some other designs as well. And it's a basic movement that gives you time precisely with a nice dial, wearable on any occasion, sport, classic, suit, formal, informal, and it's Patek Philippe. That's the magic word.
That's it. And John, again, as somebody who views the values of watches often, there's been recent news on our site and elsewhere about how the hip-hop community has kind of adopted the Nautilus as its own for the first time in a while. You know, we've had the Big Bangs and the offshores and things like that. Now the Nautilus, which is such a pure icon of modern watchmaking, do you think that will have an adverse effect on value, or will it be a positive effect on value?
It's interesting because we could look at Audemars Piguet had in past years the similar the hip hop community stood behind the watch. There's a lot of diamonds, a lot of jewels, and many in the prices. People were paying very good prices at retail to own these. But then we saw those same gem set watches show up at auction. It was a different story. I was thinking the question of icons is quite interesting, because we can go back in history and see certain pieces that were icons of their era that are completely undesirable right now. Take the classic mesh bracelet watch from the 1970s, 34, 35 millimeters with mesh brace, whether it's Audemars Piguet, Patek Philippe, Omega. This watch today is very, I hate to say undesirable at auction. They go for essentially scrap value. So I wonder what the future of iconic watches hold when tastes change abruptly, and that's a question we always ask at auction when people want to know, is this a safe thing to put my money in?
Sure. And I mean, if you look back at Patek Philippe advertising from the 1950s, it wasn't really the complications or the chronographs, things like that were the most expensive. It was the ultra thin watches.
Absolutely.
And so, how do you think the tastes have changed from that, really elegant, slim watchmaking being the tour de force to complications and chronographs? What changed, and what are you fearful of for the next generation? I think
up until the 1960s, the brands were chasing accuracy and thinness. Even the famous 2526 with the automatic 12600 caliber was considered too thick when it came out in the early 1950s. People thought it was unsightly. And they had a tough time selling their 586 examples. So over time, they got thinner, thinner, and thinner, and more accurate. But as mechanical wristwatches were so accurate by the 1960s, before the quartz revolution, it changed everything, where the watchmakers had to find something else to sell their wares. And that's where complications became as we see them today. That is the ultimate trophy. Over time, going back hundreds of years, a timepiece was a sign of luxury. It was a sign of wealth, and this is true in the 1600s as it was in our current era. So I think over time we're going to see different watches become different icons. Tastes will change, just like hemlines do with dresses and in fashion. The same thing is going to change with wristwatches, with the size of the diameter. I never even imagined 5 years ago people wearing a 35 millimeter watch on their wrist and it be considered normal. And now you see it all the time.
And so, Marco, to jump to you, as somebody who is working on creating potentially a future icon or a classic, what do you look at as inspiration, and how do you view your product relative to contemporaries like a Pijorn and Max Busser?
Let's say that everything about this new brand is the inspiration. As you say, we got inspired by a period of time that is the 60s and the 70s, where a lot has been done in the watchmaking industry. Very likely, the most iconic part and most renowned part of the work done in this period was the automatic chronograph. And there were at this time several brands developing their own automatic chronograph or working with other brands, collaborating with them to develop it. And we've been inspired by these shapes, by this feeling of a solid product with very clear lines that are today influencing some design for several brands. And the construction of the watch itself, with these bezels, with this finishing, is something that is being, I would say, brought back from many brands, but none of them had the chance probably to reinterpret these codes in an innovative way. So that's what we are trying to do, to reimagine the iconic things that comes from the past and to propose them back in a contemporary way. As I said before, I don't know if it will be iconic, but what I'm seeing from those days, meeting people, potential client journalists, is that when you propose something that give you the chance to remind you something that you have in your memories, and they push it to another level, you have a very strong power in your hands. You can really talk to the heart of people.
Sure. And just to quickly go back, John, what were you saying about F. Pijorn, by the way? I'm kidding.
Where is he?
He's right there. Yeah, he just walked in. Yeah.
I was saying very good things.
Yeah.
Go buy one now.
Yeah. So Marco, just to come back to you a little bit. So do you, when working on this project, obviously you collaborated with Jean-Marc for the movement. Did you say this is what you wanted to do in a watch, or did the movement come to you first and then you built around it?
That's pretty funny because what happened with Jean-Marc is something, I think, quite crazy in the watch industry. I've been dreaming about making this central chronograph with a satellite time, and I was looking for a watchmaker building the movement. So I had the chance to invite Jean-Marc for a lunch, and I showed him the design of the watch. So the project, the idea started from the design. But the fate was that Jean-Marc was working on the same idea as mine for the previous 7 years. So we met at a point in time where we both had the same ideas, the same energy to push this project forward, and we moved really in parallel. His project on the technical side and my project on the design side. That is pretty, I think, unique. Normally, the technique drives the aesthetic.
So, you know, in my role as a moderator here, I have been encouraged by some of the organizers to prompt a debate of kind. So I'm going to pit two of my friends against each other a little bit here. We have Pascal in the camp of vintage Rolex, Breitling, Omega, things like that, as a lover of sports watches. And I know you believe that those are the future icons, and that's what you like to wear. And then we have Mr. Reardon on the end, who's aware of, I think, a 35mm yellow gold watch. And I think the 570 is your favorite reference, or among the favorite reference. Right. So Pascal, why do you think the sports watches, like the GMT you're wearing, will become the future collectibles?
It's not that I believe it's going to be the future collectible. I think today it is. Talking about changing style, renewing style, we see this new movement. This new movement of watches being reduced in size after a big increase. And of course, with all design things, there is always waves that are coming back. Now you see these people, the youngsters are buying a lot of Daniel Wellington kind of watches that are very cheap watches, but very, very classic, very, very small. And a lot of these are also entering into mechanical watches through vintage watches like that, through Datejust, through very classical watch. So I think I'm not categoric and I'm not stubborn. I'm very open collector. I'm sure many things will probably coexist in the future. But I think sports watch of some kind, be it a GMT, a diver watch, or a chronometer, is part of the history of the last decades and is probably going to last very long. I mean, as long as the mechanical watch do exist and is still fashionable, I'm sure this is the type of watch that is going to exist, of course. Sure. It's a very distinctive and it's very distinctive style, and as such, it has a distinctive feature that will last.
And then, John, why are you such a fan of the more classical watches?
Wow, it's hard to debate with you, Pascal, because I agree with you. So, but I'm going to use your words. I mean, it comes down to timeless design, and as long as there are mechanical timepieces being worn and appreciated, I'm fine if it's from 1920 or if it's from 2017, because it's all part of the same DNA. It's especially if it's a piece that is handmade or hand finished to the same degree. And there are many sports watches today that are by many makers. Vintage captures my heart, and for this one reason, is because they weren't designed with the assistance of computers. And I really see before watches designed before the 1980s, they have a different case construction, definitely a different dial construction. The movements are made in the same traditional methods, but you aesthetically see and feel something very different. So when I put a vintage watch on my wrist, it does something very different than if I go and put on a modern production piece. There are certain brands, certain watchmakers, certainly independent makers who are very much part of this tradition of pushing the edge with designing by hand and not using just computers. There are other companies, I think they have a button they push out and it just regurgitates a new design every year and changes a 0.5 millimeter. And that, I don't agree with that. So I am very pro-vintage for those traditional reasons.
Yeah, you know, John, it's funny. Earlier today, I was sitting right here, and to my right was Kurt Klaus, the legendary watchmaker from IWC. We were talking about design, and he brought up the fact that in his early days at IWC, there were not computers. And I said, has anything changed since the days of no computers to computers? And he said, no, absolutely not. He said that the design starts up here, and that really nothing has changed. The computer just allows it to be expressed. So I would tend to agree with you, for sure. But Mr. Klaus, who's a little bit more familiar with the design process, says otherwise. Sure.
For a while, I might object on this. I don't know. Take the Submariner, which is here forever, 1953. I think it's totally different feeling to own and see on someone's wrist an old Submariner with some patina, with some kind of life, and the proportions are probably different, and you have an acrylic glass. It's totally different to a 2017 Submariner, which is sturdy, which is probably built forever. You can throw it at windows. It's going to work for decades, which is great, great qualities. But for myself, so we don't have much to argue, I'm sorry, but I would tend to say that although the computer make probably the slight difference, is also in a design and today's design and the way things are done that make probably a slight difference, but for me it's a hell of a difference. I mean, it's a totally game changer. And yeah, this is why I'm a more vintage guy than a modern guy.
And yet your day job is to
promote the industry.
Right, to promote new watches.
Yeah, well, it's just my personal taste, so I'm just in front of you speaking of my taste, and don't say that the brands do things wrong.
Sure.
There's two different things. It doesn't appeal to me, but obviously it appeals to millions of people around the year, every year,
Sure.
which is good. And I'm going to argue that mechanical watchmaking, to be appreciated, has a whole variety of lovers. There is no one collector type, so there's no one client type. There's a diversity in everything that is proposed to the clients and to the diversity of client taste that is capturing every need forever, hopefully.
And Mohammed, you were nice enough to show us yesterday some of your personal collection. And there was one watch that I think is so fascinating. It was a Daytona 6263 with a UAE crest on the dial. And this watch, you told us, most of these watches came through your family's business in the late 70s.
Yes.
And you said at the time, you couldn't sell them, nobody wanted them. People would come in and try to remove the dial, or remove the crest from the dial. And now they're worth untold thousands. I mean, really some of the hottest watches in the world.
Yes, they are.
How did that happen?
I think it was the vision of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed, the ruler, current ruler of Dubai. And at that time, he was the youngest Minister of Defense, which he was appointed in 1976. The watches were produced between 1978 and 1980. And I think I forgot to mention this yesterday. It's the only Rolex that doesn't have the name Rolex on the dial. The Daytona 6263, and you can correct me with that. I believe that icons are created by us. As the watch industry, we create icons. We have geniuses, we have decision makers, we have today Hodinkee that build up an icon for the future. And in the 70s, the vision of creating a watch for the Ministry of Defense wasn't to make it an iconic piece, but and the story that I was saying, I'll just share it with everyone, is that we ended up with extra watches, and we had to sell them, obviously. And a few of our clients bought the watches and tried to remove the crest from the dials. And the prices of the watches at that time were around $1,500. Today, maybe the hands would not be as cheap as that.
Yeah, a little bit more.
The watches, if I'm not mistaken, the last auction went up to almost 500,000 Swiss francs. So it's an iconic piece that was built, created by collectors, by people who love watches. And the funny thing is that it's not only collected by people from the UAE, it's from all around the world. So it is an icon. It's a true icon.
Absolutely. It's
Yes.
funny. I know John and I both kind of occasionally see the Italian vintage watch contingency, and the UAE dials are the hottest watches in Italy, of all places. You know, they're Rolex lovers, of course.
Yes.
And John, how have you seen the market for the UAE dials change over the past few years?
Oh, it's incredible. I mean, everybody wants to walk in a room and show a watch that nobody else has. And to have a UA crest, to have a Khanjar from Oman, to have something that distinguishes it is very important. But now everyone's like, well, is it a different color?
Right.
Is there some sort of nuance? Is the stamp just a bit different? Is it authentic or is it not? And I think that's a good point. People are actually faking some of these stamps now today in order to make them worth 3, 4, or 5 times market value. So it all comes down to authenticity and having something that no one else at the dinner table has, something special where you can tell a story and you just make your icons better than his icon.
And would you say, Pascal, would you say that the idea of these like kind of micro differentiation between, say, Rolex dials, is that something that you think will last? You know, the Mark 1, Mark 2, all the way up to 7 in the case of the Sea Dweller. Is that something that you think will resonate for decades to come, or is that something that only exists right now in this hyper-focused market?
I think the market for Rolex is so big, it's attracting so many buyers, and this is going to last. And therefore, you will have enough people to debate about these things for forever, probably, or at least for decades. Yeah, I think it's going to last. For long. Yeah. Yeah, but it's also depending on the size of the market. I think the Rolex market is probably the biggest one by far, and therefore you have all kinds of buyers, and they will object on any kind of small details, and they could argue for all their lifetime.
And then, Mohammed, as somebody who retails Rolex, do you see the same attention paid to modern Rolex as you do to vintage? Yeah.
Vintage Rolexes had the problem of, as you said, Mark I, Mark II. It was dials that were made by mistake, and today they are worth a lot. In the modern watches, they are studying it so well to avoid these kind of mistakes. However, recently we saw with the Explorer 1 that was recently launched, they did it for 1 year and then they stopped it and they changed the 369 with Superluminova. I guess and I believe that Rolex want to recreate the mistake dials and to have the Mark I and Mark II for future references.
Do you think they want to do that?
I think so. And it's the same thing goes for Patek Philippe with the 5270, which we were talking about yesterday as well. We already have 5 different variations of dials with different colors and different shapes and different shades and chin and no chin and everything. So companies are looking at what has happened in the past as mistakes and are creating, in my opinion, I might be wrong, are creating mistakes now in order for them to have value in the future.
Marco, do you subscribe to that type of thinking with your products?
I think iconic vintage watches are worth that money because they were made by mistake, and they were made, let's say, they were meant to be done like this. Today, a lot of brands, as Mohammed just said, are playing with that. And I'm sure the customers are pretty aware of it. And I mean, they understand that if the dial change every year and a half, it won't have the same value in the future because of course is rare, but when you talk about Rolex, they produce how many tenth of thousand of pieces with the same dial. So the rarity of a vintage watch is given by the scarcity. And scarcity means small numbers. If you produce a watch in 100,000 pieces, is not rare anymore.
And back to the idea of icons and classics. Pascal, is there one watch that you think should be an icon and just isn't for whatever reason?
Today?
Yeah. Vintage or new?
Wow. Let me think about it. Nothing comes to my mind right now.
John, anything?
I think we can't say the word icon without thinking of the Jaeger-LeCoultre Reverso.
Yeah.
And from the 1930s, it was a sports watch for polo players. This piece never saw the masses. I mean, it wasn't a piece to be worn by everyone. It was definitely not the Submariner of its era, but it was a piece that was bought by royalty. It was appreciated by a very small select few. And it was form follows function, but in the most creative way. And for that reason, I think it's an icon to this day.
Please?
Do you think it is not iconic?
I do think it's iconic. Absolutely.
Yeah. And Mohammed, any watch that you think deserves to be elevated in the echelons of horology?
I would still insist on Rolex.
Rolex.
You would never see me wearing a Rolex, but I love collecting Rolexes. They have a nice piece of history behind them. They have a lot of stories behind them. Diver watches, Explorer watches, President watches. And it's one of the only brands today, if we ask a person who's not into watches and you ask him what is a Rolex, he will tell you it's a watch. So the way they built the image, was it by mistake? Was it a marketing strategy? Was it done to build it this way? We don't know. But they have come to a point that they have become Rolex as a watch. And it's the only brand today, if you compare it to any other brands, they say Rolex is on one side, all the other brands are on the other side. Very basic, very to the point, but with precise quality, big history, and I'm sure for any collector, they must have at least one Rolex, whether it's a vintage Rolex or a modern Rolex, they must have at least one.
Yeah. In the US anyway, I know this is true, I would imagine it's true elsewhere, but in the US they say that 60% of all luxury watches, all watches above $5,000 sold in the US is a Rolex, more than half. Which is pretty unbelievable, but at the same time completely believable. Many of these icons work equally well on men and women. Why do you think that is at the end of the day? And anybody who'd like to answer. Pascal?
Thank you.
Well, you're
I'm always,
yeah.
the first breaker. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Ben. No, I think, I have to agree that many, actually, vintage Rolex and other models on a woman is particularly sexy, and I think it fits really well the women. And okay, I think it's part of the design. I don't know if there's the specific reason, but I really don't think there is kind of an iconic watch that was designed for a woman at first, which is a pity. But we all know that wristwatches are mainly thought and developed for men first. Maybe we can have that change in the future, but I don't see it. I mean, with the current production as a,
I would like just to keep on developing on your comment. I have a point of view that is pretty straight about it. Watches are meant to be instruments, and that's the reason why probably they didn't used to have a connotation. Actually, a watch is a watch, as a car is a car. If you want to buy a Porsche, you're not asking for a feminine Porsche. You're asking for the 911. If you want to buy a Rolex Daytona, you want the Rolex Daytona. You don't want the feminine version of the Rolex Daytona. So I think that what makes a watch iconic is the power of the design and the recognizability of it. Then, as Pascal said, there were not many watches made for women, but that's because of the function, I guess. Today, brands are forcing a lot because, first of all, it's a very big opportunity for brand to make watches dedicated to women, but very likely the declination of a male model because the size, because of colors, but I mean the main characteristic of the design are still the same. They are just scaled and changed in tone.
What I wanted to ask you is trend functions a little bit in counter cycles. So we have the fabulous shapes and colors of the 70s as a reaction to the purism of the 60s, and I'll say that I think the watch Marco is wearing is almost an instant classic to me, and we these days we are seeing an overdoses of neo-retro and new vintage styles in the watches that are launched by the main brands. So I wanted to know what is your take on the new retro and new vintage trend, and also we could be sitting here and in 10 years time we could be living a counter cycle with extremely modern watches as a reaction to what we're living today. I'd like to know your take on that subject.
Sure. Maybe Mohammed, would you like to begin?
Today, people are into vintage stuff, not only watches. I have one of my brother who's into vintage cars, And me being a watch lover, I'm against him, but I'm sure he has a different point of view. You need space, you need insurance, you need to service them, you cannot find the parts, etc., etc. In fashion, we see, and I'm sure a lot of ladies would agree with me, we're going back into different cuts from vintage styles from the 60s or the 70s in terms of colors that are used. So today the market is moving according to what the consumer needs. And the watch industry, again, not all of them, but a lot of the brands are going into the vintage style or iconic pieces with a modern twist always. It's a phase, and looking at the watch industry since the X number of years that it's been existing, it's all about tradition. We have today brands that are very modern, but they always go back to traditional craftsmanship of watchmaking. They will use modern technology to come up with a new movement, with a new complication, but the way they make it, it will always be traditional. Traditional and vintage are different, we agree, but it's a fashion wave, I can say, and people that cannot afford vintage watches because the prices, thanks to our friends, they're rocketing. And as Marco said, they're becoming rarer and rarer, and people who are buying them are not willing to sell them because they want to keep it for them, not only for investment, but to keep them because there is a history behind it. Paul Newman is an iconic piece, and it's a watch that he wore. I don't think that we will ever see something as important as that in history of watchmaking. It's one watch that he had and it's gone. But we're looking at a lot of watches that are following the trend of the Paul Newman with the panda dials. Why? Because it was an icon and people want to have something similar to that, and they're proud to say the story about it. So it's a wave, and it's a good wave. It's not a negative wave. We're happy for that, and we hope it stays. I hope I answered your question.
Sure. And just to add one question of my own onto that. So the Paul Newman obviously sold for $17.8 million. It's a very simple Valjoux 72. Meanwhile, a few months earlier, the Patek Philippe Calibre 89 failed to sell at $5.5 million. John, why do you think that was?
That's a great question. I think we have to look beyond the scope of now. There's one thing that's constant, and that's change. And we see that in any taste and in any category. I think 2017 will always be remembered, or at least in all of our lifetimes, as that year that Paul Newman brought this extraordinary amount that very, very few people expected. I certainly didn't expect a number in that range. I also did not expect the Calibre 89 not to sell, because that is the piece that's the pinnacle of 20th century watchmaking after the super complication. So the beauty of auction is there's always surprise. You never know what's going to happen. But let's get in our DeLorean time traveler and go into the future. Let's go 20 years into the future. Actually, let's go 30 years into the future, even better. It's the year 2047. And we have a Christie's auction that has lot 7 is the Paul Newman, and then lot 8 is the Calibre 89, which is going to bring more in 30 years. My personal opinion, I bet everyone here, this could be a good debate. I'm absolutely sure, in my personal opinion, the Calibre 89 will absolutely pummel in value the Paul Newman. I think the Paul Newman will not be remembered in the same way he has this emotional value to us, but the Calibre 89, it will be understood and presented in a way of how important it is to the history of timekeeping in the future.
Ian, yes.
Many of the icons we've been talking about are decades, if not half a century old. how much time do you think we do need? What's the minimum amount of time to say that's an icon rather than just a fashion fad or something like that? And what is the youngest true icon for each of you?
You have him sitting in front of us. He's a legend for the modern watches, in my opinion. And I'm not saying that because he's sitting in front of us. I love his watches. He's a legend, and I believe that his watches are iconic today. Looking at the way the movement is structured and built, looking at how simple it is yet complicated, makes it an iconic piece from the modern watch industry, my opinion. So I think everyone has a different opinion.
If I may, well, not disagree, but I think I love François Paul's watches, of course. I'm sorry. Very I think it's probably an icon to be, but for me, an iconic watch is at least 1 or 2 generations, because it has to transcend time, it has to transcend trends, to transcend fashion. It has to be forever in your mind. Like, you know it's good, but your son is going to know it's good as well. It's something that is intangible, and I think it transcends time and generations, and it needs time to prove itself as a true icon. For me, I think it's very personal.
And Marco?
I think something becomes iconic when in the common knowledge remind you about something. And I mean, talking for myself, I start collecting things that are meaningful to me, that remind me when I was a child or something that happened at that period of time. So watches, car, other stuff that have any meaning to my life, my personal life, can become iconic. And I think, generally speaking, people buying these vintage objects, they look for something to reassure them in a world today where objects are meant to last just a few months. And buying a vintage watch or a vintage car, I do agree with your brother. A vintage car is not efficient, is not comfortable, it breaks down, but when you drive it, you feel something different than a modern car.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And John, what would your answer be to that question?
I think that I think the car analogy is great. When you put on a vintage watch, when you wind it, you set it, you put it on your wrist, there's a different emotional connection than you have to something
it's
modern.
music to your ears.
Music. And I love, even with minute repeaters, vintage repeaters in particular, what you're hearing and seeing is the same that was heard and seen years ago when that watch was created. And we haven't discussed pocket watches much tonight, but hopefully we can get to that later. So.
And although nobody asked me, I'll give you an answer. My answer would be certainly FP Journe for sure. The Resonance in particular is one of my personal favorites, but also the Lange 1, I think has the possibility of becoming a true icon. It's something that it takes a little while for people to warm up to, but I think really has potential to be a lasting classic. And we know Lange will keep it in their collection for a very long time. Another question. Sir.
I have a very, oh, sorry.
Oh, whoever has the microphone.
I have a very simple question. For you guys, is the Swatch iconic?
Yeah. For me, yes,
Yeah,
but that's
for me, yes.
Yeah.
Totally.
I used to collect Swatch, so.
I think part of the attraction of an iconic watch for me is also a game-changing watch, and I think Swatch was exactly that. It not saved the day, but almost entirely on its own. It was completely disruptive, and going back to what Marco said, disruptive design, but also the disruptive concept. And although it's not horlogerie per se, it certainly is a very iconic watch. totally, totally.
John, you would agree as well? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Next question.
Thank you for all of you about this speech. Very nice. My question to Mr. Mohammed about Rolex and its story. You talk about this long of history about Rolex. How you evaluate the way of advertising and them philosophy from beginning up to now?
Rolex have always been involved into extreme sports, but very specific sports, not everything. Today we see them in golf. In the past we saw them in diving, explorers. Today we see them with famous musicians. It is never related directly to the end consumer that they are advertising for a watch, but they just show that the people who are at a certain level with a certain love for sport or extreme sports or music or tennis, and they link it by that way that this is an iconic or a prestigious brand. You would never see, you will rarely see their advertisement showing someone wearing a watch. It's more a story that they try to build in their marketing strategy, to build the brand, not to sell it, but to show that this brand is used by everyone in different fields of sports, entertainment, and an average person who's living his normal life can even have it.
Great. I think we have time for a few more questions. Sir Anders.
Talking about Rolex and the increased quality there, looking at the vintage stuff going at auctions now, something that pushes up the prices is how it has aged, and like these tropical dials, etc. Today the quality is so good that they won't fade for another maybe 200 years. How will that affect Rolex on auctions in the future?
That's an excellent question. I think if you look at tropical dials in general, whether it's an A series, Royal Oak, or a Daytona, when it's showing age and it's in a constant state of change. So everyone right now is obsessed also with lume on their dials. That lume's going to look very different in 5 years, 10 years, and especially in 20, 30 years. In many cases, it could flake off and be gone. So I think over time, at least in the auction world, we're going to be looking at it in how it's in a constant state of evolving. Eventually, even watches made today that are airtight and hermetically sealed and may not show signs of age in a vacuum shortly, they will. And I think polishing watches will always be on the outside of the case, very important. But I actually look forward to seeing how dials age in time. And even pieces that had superluminova that were made 10, 15 years ago, they're starting to show now signs of age that's sometimes unpredictable. And that's kind of the pleasure of the unknown of watch collecting.
Sorry, my question is this link between old cars and watches. So you could say that the gold standard of old cars, if you really wanted a safe bet, is to buy a Ferrari, maybe also a Rolls Royce. You know, you're pretty much not losing your money. In the watch world, it's, buy a Rolex, you're not going to lose too much money. But isn't Rolex also its worst enemy? I mean, by producing around 1 million watches a year, eventually, there are going to be so many in circulation that why would you even, what kind of value? At the end of the day, rarity counts for a lot. And there is no rarity in Rolex. So that's why provenance is everything. So you find a watch with King Fahad's face on it or the emblem of Dubai or something, suddenly it has a story. So without provenance, Rolex is its worst enemy.
I personally agree with you completely. But the demand for Rolex is so high, so global. Even though if there are 1 million watches available, they will be sold and will find a home. You could take some of the rarest pieces in the world that might have a production of 2 or 3, but if there's only one person in the world that wants them, it's supply and demand.
We have to create new icons.
Yes.
So we have something interesting for the next 30 years.
I'd like to know what you think about the trend of issuing now limited series, even for watchmakers who are producing in huge quantities, but they are now trying to sell limited series, numbered series. Do you think this watch will keep their values or increase their values?
I think so. The question is, with limited editions, with the small production, are those desirable to collectors today? At least looking from the auction perspective, and there are certain brands that, and we're all thinking of that one brand now, but I'm not going to say it, that everything is a limited edition. The market value of those at auction is sometimes 20 cents on the dollar. So even if it's a 000, but you know that there's probably 50 others, then it means nothing. I think consumers are very smart in knowing a gimmick, and when they're offered that, they react accordingly. I can't recall the name.
I really don't know, honestly.
Just to add on this, sure. Ben, we have created a lot of special editions for Dubai. Since 2006, we have done almost 40 special editions made exclusively for Dubai. And some of them have skyrocketed in prices. Some of them have been for our regular clients and friends as collectors. I believe that for some of the brands, whatever we have created legends and icons. Maybe not today, but a few years down the line, people will come and say, this was a piece made for the Dubai Watch Week 2017, and only 17 were made, and we have some of them that bought them here. And they will be proud of that, hopefully. Doing a limited edition with just changing color of the dial, it's not really a limited edition, but playing a little bit more, going deeper into creating something where our friends, our consumers are telling us that this is what we want, and we listen to them, and we make sure that the brands do what our client wants, not what we want to sell to them, because for them this would be an iconic piece. Whether it is an iconic piece internationally or not, for them it will be an iconic piece, and this is what we are doing. And we hope all the watch industry does this in this kind of trend, rather than just printing different colors with X numbers and having limited editions available, but the regular collection not available. And I don't know which brand we're talking about again, but it's two-sided. So I believe in limited editions.
And I think, Pascal, you had an addendum to an earlier comment?
Yeah, because Ben asked me what should be an icon and is not today. And maybe because I'm Swiss, I'm a bit slow, but I thought it through. I think today Breitling and Zenith are two brands that are largely undervalued. They have a very big history, and they have very nice and distinctive design in their historic line. And today they hardly, I don't know, John, what you think, but they hardly go up in price, or just moderately compared to other brands. I think this is to be reminded. I think these two brands will kind of perform better in the future, in the near future. Voilà.
Great. Well, again, I want to thank our panelists here, Pascal, Marco, Mohammed, John. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you guys all. Thank you to Dubai Watch Week for having myself.